Good morning. I'm Gretchen Burns Bergman, co-founder and executive director of A New Path, which stands for Parents for Addiction Treatment and Healing. We advocate for therapeutic rather than punitive drug policies. And I'm the lead organizer of A New Path's international, Moms Unite to End the War on Drugs campaign. And we're doing this series of conversations with moms primarily. And today's topic is the difficulties of dealing with co-occurring disorders during the stressors of the pandemic, including depression, suicide, and drug use and drug overdose. So with me are three wonderful women who are all members of A New Path Board of Directors. Caroline Stewart, our president, Valerie Hebert, who is our secretary, and Karen Lenyon, new board member, and we're so happy that she's joined us. So I'd like to ask each of them to say a few words about themselves, what brought them to this work, why this topic is particularly important to them, both as advocates, clinicians, and parents. So I will start with Caroline.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. It's an honor to be here today with my dear friends. Love to be with other mothers who have walked in my shoes. I am Caroline Rideout Stewart. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and psychotherapist, retired from the Department of Psychiatry at UCSD. Over the years, I began my work as an anxiety specialist, but now find myself very busy in my practice with patients who suffer from substance use disorders. I am an inveterate harm reductionist. I have learned in a most painful way that if we do not practice harm reduction, we place our families at risk. I have a son who will turn 40 years old in 1 month, and he have been struggling with complex issues related to mental health issues and substance use for, probably 25 years. My son suffered from attention deficit disorder and anxiety disorders and learning disability as a child. He has subsequently become a complex substance user, meaning he's tried most drugs, but predominantly is an opioid user. I wanted to talk about COVID's impact on him, however, because he is into 2 years of successful sobriety using MAT, medication-assisted treatment. But what his father and I have been noticing is that he's really at the edge of relapse. He hasn't quite relapsed yet, but COVID is painting him into a terrible corner that probably has to do with his complex brain issues. But the fact is, his father and I dread phone calls because we're worried he's going to relapse. He has not yet, but he's not doing so well. So I thought it would be a good idea for we moms to discuss this issue today about how COVID is impacting the mental health and the sobriety of our adult children. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. And before I move on, I just want to ask you if you would define for people that may not know what harm reduction is. We use that term here, but maybe.
Yeah, I personally think it's, I support individuals who can be fully abstinent, and for example, that they would be in AA and they would never use any substances at all. In fact, there was an era in AA where even if you took psychiatric medications, you were seen as not being compliant. But harm reduction understands that both mental illness.
Okay, I just lost my guest, so I'm going to define harm reduction for you. Harm reduction, it can be any number of things, but Caroline was mentioning medication-assisted treatment. And to me, therapeutic services rather than incarceration is also a form of harm reduction. We all know about clean syringe exchanges. That's harm reduction for HIV, Hep C, Narcan certainly, to a safe drug that can quickly reverse an accidental opioid overdose. These are all harm reduction strategies. I see that Valerie is trying to come back on. So I'm going to go ahead and bring her back into the stream. And here she comes. And so I was just in, I don't know what happened. We lost all our guests, but I defined harm reduction while you were gone. And so Valerie, would you please share your story with us?
Yes, thank you, Gretchen. And I don't know what happened. We all just got kicked out, but what I ended up doing is closing the screen, and I went back to the login link, and then I was able to rejoin. So I hope our other two guests can come back in here. Yay, you're doing it. It's just technology, right? There's always going to be glitches, and we just have to go with it.
You know, and it's something I was thinking, boy, this is going smoothly, and then all of a sudden my guests drop off. And I'm looking there very puzzled for a while, thinking, okay, wait a minute, people are watching me look puzzled for a while. I better say something.
I would encourage Karen to, there's a little camera, and there you go. You got it. Okay.
Okay, great. Well, my name is Valerie Hebert, and I'm really happy to be here today talking about a topic that is near and dear to my heart. I am the program manager for the Children, Youth, Family Liaison at NAMI San Diego. And early intervention is really important to me because as a mom with lived experience of my oldest son's journey, which started very young for him, and technically, if you knew our full history, it basically started with my pregnancy with him and his birth experiences. So, but he really struggled all through school, and he started using drugs at a very early age as a coping mechanism because his issues were just brain issues that we just didn't really know how to deal with. As a youngster, he was also diagnosed with ADHD, and he started walking that path at a very young age. We went through his high school years, which were some of the most challenging, having to put him out of state in several different residential treatment centers to try and keep him safe. Suicide ideation was a strong element for him, and it was just his coping skills were just not there. As a family, we really just did not know how to navigate the waters. We did get him graduated from high school, but he, by that point, had developed a very strong attraction to drug use. And he, as Caroline said, he joined that opioid misuse disorder community, which there's a lot of them in our society today. So my heart really goes out to people because, like my son, most of the parents I talk to were dealing with, sensitive but beautiful souls in these children. And they just don't have the coping mechanisms to be able to navigate what the world throws at them at young ages. And so as a parent, I really have worked hard to try and advocate for his needs and our whole family's needs, because it doesn't just affect him, it affects everybody in the family. And through my work and research led me to NAMI San Diego, where I learned how to navigate mental health and addiction co-occurring disorders. And it took me personally to a much better place as well, because I found the connection and the self-care to the community that I needed, which ultimately led me to a new path. And I'm so happy to be connected to these wonderful women who share such similar stories to my own and our families. COVID impacted my son because he had really gotten himself into a very bad predicament with his drug use and misuse and his connections. There was actually a raid at our house, which landed him in a 4.8-year prison term, labeled a serial drug offender. He did manage to do well in prison and join the fire camp program, and he was let go early after about a year and a half in prison due to COVID. But the supports were not there for him, and he struggled deeply. He did relapse, and through that relapse, he was able to make better strides. But he's not one of the MAT program users. He prefers to be completely free of substances. So MAT just didn't work for him. So he is navigating and doing well currently. But the real concern there is if he decided to pick up and start using again, that he would definitely be at risk for overdose and death, because it's a very scary path that they walk, as everyone does who is an opioid user. So that's a little bit of my background. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Karen here and let you hear her story.
Oh, great. Thank you so much, Valerie. And it's just such an honor to be in the presence of all of you. And as you were all talking, I realized that we are part of a very special club. We're all moms of 2 sons. And so it just occurred to me. So I too have 2 sons. And I always like to talk. We spend so much time talking about my younger son that my older son often gets brushed off, and which is very unfortunate. And I think many of the moms who have children that are at opposite ends of the spectrum, as mine are, you end up with so much focus on the child that is struggling so much that the other child ends up getting overlooked. And so there's a whole we can have a whole nother conversation about that. But basically, I work at NAMI. I'm also a program manager for the Elevate Youth California program. And after many years of working, well, first of all, I've been involved with the public health domain for probably close to 3 decades now, and had a for-profit career prior to that. But I've just found so much more satisfaction in this realm and in this field. So I came to NAMI a few years ago, but prior to that, I worked on the prevention side of substance misuse. And I became very disillusioned because as many times as I told our son, not to use drugs, they were bad for him, it seemed to work in the opposite direction. So I thought I need to do something else here. So he too, his story is very similar to my colleagues, had many learning disorders when he was growing up, struggled in school tremendously. We went to lots of different doctors, had lots of different diagnoses, everything from ADHD, extreme anxiety, high depression, to bipolar, every label that you could think of, we got a diagnosis for. And it seemed that whatever specialist we went to that specialized in that thing, that's what he was diagnosed as. So it was very confusing for all of us. And I really have started replacing my terminology of self-medication with relief seeking. In terms of all of the other stigmatizing language we use, I think self-medicating should be added there at the top of the list, because what he was doing was trying to find some kind of relief from the symptoms that he was having, which of course created another situation. And that's where we ended up, was with a co-occurring condition. So he too found his way to opioid misuse and developed a very serious problem that landed him in the hospital several times. And last year, he actually had endocarditis, which is a very severe staph infection of the heart valve, and had open heart surgery to have that repaired. So it was a devastating illness in addition to everything else. And there were lots of situations that were created because of that, and so much stigma in the hospital. He kept hearing things like, well, because of your history, we can't let you go home. And he ended up spending 77 days in the hospital, which is 11 weeks, almost 3 months. And the reason, had he been anybody else, they would have sent him home with a portable, with an open PICC line, which is a permanent IV situation for his antibiotic treatments that he needed, but they would not let him go home. And there was such a gap in services because there was no place for him to go. He couldn't go home. He couldn't go to another facility that would handle an open PICC line. And so they just parked him in the hospital with virtually no services for either his issues that he was having with substance misuse or his emotional or psychological health. So that created a very serious combination of problems for him and for our family. I mean, I was at the hospital every day advocating for him. And I would just say, as moms, this is what we need to do for our children. And it's unfortunate because they are adults, but they are not able to advocate for themselves. And because of the stigma that's created by their illnesses and their diseases, they are not listened to. And so COVID presented some really big challenges for us. He actually left the hospital before COVID hit, but had another infection that happened afterwards, right at the beginning of COVID. So he found himself back in the hospital again in March of last year, which was, as you'll remember, that was, right when it was the end of March. So, I mean, we were right at the beginning of this pandemic. Hospitals were not letting anyone in other than patients. And so, it was very problematic. He didn't have his advocate there. They inserted another PICC line, and I was thinking they were going to keep him for another, God knows how many months. I wasn't really sure that he would really be able to survive that. And they actually kicked him out of the hospital within 5 days because they were anticipating this influx of people sick with COVID, and I kind of felt like he was kicked to the curb, honestly. So there was not much follow-up. He was sent home with an open PICC line and a little bit of service coming to the house. He also had an open wound in his chest because it had gotten infected. So COVID really, in terms of his physical health, his mental health, his health in terms of his substance misuse, severely impacted all of that. Thankfully, just so that I leave you with something a little bit positive, he too has used medication-assisted treatment for many years. He was always on buprenorphine, was at the maximum dose, and it never seemed to cover him. And I had met someone who was very skilled with methadone treatments. And this individual told me early on that he was on the wrong medication. And so it took many years for him to realize that and for us to actually get him to the right OTP, opioid treatment program, which happened last August. And I'm happy to say that since he has switched to methadone, because there are many different forms of medication-assisted treatment and not one form works for everyone. So he has done phenomenally on methadone because he feels better. It's covering all of his cravings. He's able to function and not use. And so he has some ways to go, but I definitely see some hope. And he told me the other night that he sees hope for himself for the first time in many, many years. So that's a praise report on that. So we're so happy.
And that's what we talk about, many pathways to recovery. There's not one size fits all for anyone. Each of them are individuals. And in the past, when people would lose their way, that we looked at it like it was their fault rather than that treatment, that the combination of the treatment and the client was not working properly, and we would adjust. It was always, they're the bad ones. They fell out. They couldn't do it. They relapsed, all that kind of stuff. Hopefully we're coming to a better place with that. But, I should just say that my two sons both struggled for decades with heroin addiction. And, and one is the survivor of overdose. They both work as drug and alcohol counselors and have seen firsthand with the difficulties of providing appropriate care when you can't be in the rooms with people. And they both described clients who have lost their way. I'm saying lost their way because the whole idea of relapse is the word is kind of a little bit loaded, but so they've lost people to overdose. They've lost people that have gone back out on the streets, and it's very frustrating for particularly during COVID when there's that isolation, that depression, to deliver proper services and care for people. So, you know that since COVID started, overdose deaths have gone up by 13% in the United States. So we were really dealing with it. And you know what, Valerie, I'm going to go to you to talk a little bit more about these vulnerable drug-dependent populations that are at such high risk during COVID, and maybe you can describe why it is that way.
Right. You know, in my son's situation, he made the choice that MAT, medication-assisted treatment, did not work for him. When he relapsed after leaving prison and went into a detox program, they did put him on buprenorphine. But when he had previously tried buprenorphine, you know, he said it was, for him, it was just another way to get high. So everybody's going to figure out what works best for them. But he is, I feel, particularly vulnerable because if he were to pick up and start using again, and heroin is his drug of choice, then, you know, the risk for overdose is incredibly high. And right now, in our community, in the San Diego community, there's so much fentanyl on the streets right now that people with low tolerance are dying. They are dying, and there's really very little ability to save a fentanyl overdosing person without extreme measures. So, you know, it's really tricky. You know, I think our society is telling the users on the street to use the fentanyl test strips, but these, you know, people are not going to do that. Most of the time when people are trying to get high, they're going to try to get as high as they possibly can. And they seem to really like the fact that fentanyl is part of the drugs that they use. But if you take somebody who does not have that level of buildup in their system, they are going to be extremely vulnerable to overdose and death. And that's what's happening in our county right now. It's happening across the country right now. And it's a very, very nerve-wracking time for families who have somebody who is using substances. So, and whether they're using heroin or, because fentanyl is being found in all different kinds of substances.
Cocaine.
Yeah. So it is just, it's a very scary time, and the risk of overdose and death is high right now. So the most important thing is to get that educational piece. If you're not a regular user, use the fentanyl test strips and figure out what it is that you're dealing with.
So, you know, when you describe the fentanyl test strips, I think that their benefit is more in the club scenes, where people who are thinking that they're maybe taking ecstasy or whatever, it lets you know that there's fentanyl presence. For opioid users, they pretty much know that there's fentanyl, but the problem is they don't know how much. And so the test strips don't show you that.
Right.
I'm going to move to Caroline because I know that fear of the real high risk of returning to homelessness and incarceration is something that you know that you're worried about for your son. So yeah.
So actually, I'd like to also, I'll answer both in a different way. The question you asked Valerie about what those histories. For example, my son's attention disorder and his learning disability has made COVID very complicated because he's not a highly technical, competent person. And so with all the AA meetings going into Zoom, I mean, I have been using as a professional technology for 25 years, and I have found it overwhelming. And my son gets very anxious and frustrated. And then he starts to kind of turn on himself, I think. And so I just wanted to comment on why that learning disabled or attention disorder population would be especially wounded by some of the technicalities of COVID. I think what's happened is that my son, right when COVID began, was given a experimental COVID testing kit that was a rapid turnaround, 2 hours. And back in the day, those test kits that you purchased on the street weren't very functional. A lot of them had errored readouts. My son had been 18 months stable in sober living, and he was making plans to transition into an apartment and keep going to his meetings. But what happened is his COVID test came up positive, and he was given 2 hours to get out, and he wasn't going to move for another month. And it felt very triggering, like he was being kicked out because he was not sober, and that was not true. And it was devastating. And so the good news is his roommate also tested positive, and they were going to be roommates, sober roommates in their apartment, and they are still in that apartment. But what's going on now is my son has been incredibly lonely. He was attending high school not virtually, was physically going to high school, and was about 3 weeks from taking his high school diploma, not GED, but his full diploma. And he was preparing to enter animal behavior school and dog grooming program. But everything went virtual. And again, my son's adeptness with virtuality, not so good. He did keep taking his math classes online, but it missed something. And I will tell you, the AA meetings were absolutely not meeting the mark. Something about his attention disorder, very hard for him to stay as an observer in such a passive setting. It really was difficult. So what happened is his roommate works all day. We love his roommate, but my son tragically ran into, on the street, he ran into some old homeless encampment friends, and he returned to his homeless encampment. So here, this is ironic. He has a very nice apartment, but he is spending more and more time along the Mission Valley riverbed with his friends, and his father and I are devastated. And he brings those folks, I shouldn't say those folks, he was one of them, but they come into the apartment, and I know there's risk for a return of drug use. I know that he's just so vulnerable. He's still sober because he's getting drug tested now, but for several months, even his physician was not drug testing him, and his PO was not drug testing him, all because of COVID. So all of the kind of protective, the protective fence, not the fence to isolate him, but the fence to protect him, were gone. He had no oversight. So anyway, he's sober. We're praying that he re-engages with his AA community in person as soon as possible. So that's kind of what's going on.
Thanks. We're going to go over time, so I hate to do this to you, Karen, but just a quick question, and if you can answer it in a minute. We wanted to talk about the unique challenges of being an individual with an individual of color who struggles to maintain sobriety during the pandemic. So if you could address that in a minute.
Absolutely. Okay. Yeah. And so the audience might be wondering why you're asking me that question. So my children are biracial. So their father is African American, and so they don't look like me. And so my younger son has had many interactions with the justice system, and just over silly things like leading the syringe exchange service program. He gets followed by SDPD and then pulled over on some kind of bogus charge, like you didn't stop far enough behind the line, and then searched. I mean, he knows by now what his rights are, and but he still gets searched. The last time happened right during COVID, actually, and so and now they do arrests on the street. So he was handcuffed, arrested, and then released, but. The whole thing got thrown out because it was an illegal search. But I'm just saying it was very traumatizing because it was, I don't even remember how many times it's been that he's been arrested. And so I wanted to make a note also about COVID with the isolation factor. So my son's a person who does not he's not that social with his use. And so when COVID hit, he loved doing the meetings online because it meant that he didn't have a UA, and his therapist, his doctor, could not see that he had lost 35 pounds. And so those were all great things. He could miss the meetings. So for him, that he kind of was hiding behind that. So COVID actually, it was obviously not a positive thing, but for him, he thought it was great. So for individuals who really like the isolation and like being able to hide behind the camera, that's another factor. So something probably, that you would not have thought of, but it happens with COVID. And I think I've gone over a minute. So they'll have to tune in on Monday for the rest of our comments.
That's okay. I really wanted to get to your story because, we've been talking a lot about the triple crisis, really, of COVID, of opioid overdose, and systemic racism. And it's three factors that have to be addressed together
Right.
and openly. So I want to thank you all so much. And this is hopefully a little teaser for our 101, which is going to be held on Monday at 6 p.m. Pacific time. You'll hear more from Caroline, Valerie, and Karen, as well as Anita Fisher will be joining us for that conversation. So it'll be an hour and a half, and we'll have a little bit of a deeper dive into this conversation. And so if you would like to join us, just email April, the name or month April, at anewpath.org, and we can get you the link for that. And so we hope you will join us, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll see you guys.
on Monday.
See you on Monday. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.